December 24th, 1944. Western Germany. Snow pressed softly against the shattered windows of a former schoolhouse converted into a field hospital. The building smelled of antiseptic, damp wool, and smoke drifting from distant artillery. Inside, rows of wounded men lay beneath thin blankets, German soldiers, American casualties, and civilians caught between collapsing front lines. German nurses moved quietly between beds. Their uniforms were worn from months without proper supplies. Many had not slept fully in days. They worked without conversation, avoiding the eyes of the American soldiers now guarding the entrance. Propaganda had warned them what capture would mean. They expected humiliation, perhaps worse. Outside, dusk settled early over the ruined town. Then, from near the doorway, a group of American soldiers gathered beside a small Christmas tree, assembled from broken branches and medical gauze. One began to sing, softly, uncertainly. Not in English, in German. The first words of a familiar hymn filled the ward. And for the first time since the war reached their homeland, the nurses stopped work. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War in Europe had entered its final and most desperate phase. After the Allied landings in Normandy in June, German forces had been pushed steadily eastward across France and toward the borders of the Reich itself. Cities that had once seemed distant from combat now felt the war closing in from every direction. The Western Front moved with relentless pressure. American, British, and Canadian armies advanced through Belgium and into Western Germany, supported by overwhelming air superiority and industrial strength that Germany could no longer match. Strategic bombing had crippled transportation networks, destroyed factories, and strained civilian infrastructure beyond recovery. Rail stations lay in ruins, hospitals overflowed, fuel shortages paralyzed movement. Yet the German military system continued functioning through sheer necessity. Medical personnel, including thousands of trained nurses, became essential to sustaining the collapsing war effort. Many served under organizations such as the German Red Cross or military medical auxiliaries attached directly to Wehrmacht field hospitals. Unlike frontline troops, these nurses were not combatants, but they operated dangerously close to battle zones. As Allied forces advanced, hospitals frequently relocated, often occupying schools, churches, or municipal buildings hastily converted into treatment centers. By late 1944, conditions inside these facilities were grim. Supplies dwindled rapidly. Morphine shortages forced doctors to perform procedures with limited anesthesia. Bandages were washed and reused. Electricity failed regularly, leaving operations conducted under lantern light or candles. Nurses worked extended shifts, sometimes exceeding 20 hours at a time, caring for wounded soldiers arriving faster than they could be treated. The psychological burden matched the physical exhaustion. Years of Nazi propaganda had shaped expectations about the enemy. German civilians and medical workers alike had been warned that Allied soldiers, particularly Americans, would seek revenge for the war's devastation. Stories circulated of brutality, imprisonment, or humiliation awaiting anyone captured. For nurses stationed near the front, surrender meant uncertainty. They feared not only personal danger, but the collapse of their professional purpose. At the same time, the German population experienced growing disillusionment. News from the front contradicted official broadcasts promising victory. Refugees streamed westward ahead of advancing armies. Bombed towns filled with displaced families searching for shelter. Hospitals became islands of fragile order amid widening chaos. In December 1944, Germany launched one final offensive, the Ardennes counterattack, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. The operation briefly slowed Allied momentum, but ultimately drained Germany's remaining reserves. When the offensive failed, Allied armies resumed their advance with renewed strength, pushing deeper into German territory. As towns fell one by one, field hospitals often became the first places where enemies met not as soldiers in combat, but as wounded men and exhausted caregivers. American troops entering these facilities encountered German nurses still tending patients, sometimes treating both sides simultaneously under international medical conventions. These encounters were tense, uncertain, and deeply human, because in the quiet spaces of wartime medicine, ideology mattered less than survival, and it was within one such hospital, during the coldest Christmas of the war, that an unexpected moment would challenge everything both sides believed about one another. By December 1944, winter settled heavily across Western Europe. Snow-blanketed forests and villages from Belgium to the German frontier, muting the sounds of artillery but not the war itself. Temperatures dropped below freezing, turning roads into sheets of ice and slowing both armies. Frostbite cases rose sharply among soldiers on both sides, filling already overcrowded medical stations. Hospitals near the front became places suspended between conflict and neutrality. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel were to be protected and allowed to continue caring for the wounded regardless of nationality. In practice, however, reality was complicated. Retreating German units often abandoned facilities with little warning. Nurses were left behind with patients too injured to move, uncertain whether advancing Allied forces would treat them as protected medical staff or enemy collaborators. Many chose to remain. For German nurses, professional duty outweighed personal fear. Training emphasized care without discrimination, even during total war. Diaries from the period describe women continuing to change bandages and administer medicine while artillery echoed nearby, unsure which army would enter the building next. Meanwhile, American soldiers advancing through occupied territory encountered scenes far removed from battlefield expectations. Instead of resistance, they often found hospitals filled with wounded Germans, civilian refugees, and exhausted medical workers who had not slept properly in days. The contrast created immediate tension. American troops had endured brutal combat across France and Belgium. Many had lost friends during the Normandy campaign or the fighting in the Hürtgen forest, one of the war's most grueling engagements. They entered German territory, carrying memories of destroyed towns and fierce resistance. Yet inside hospitals, weapons were lowered. Doctors and nurses became intermediaries between former enemies. Communication remained difficult. Few Americans spoke German fluently. Many nurses knew only basic English phrases learned before the war. Interactions relied on gestures, translators, or handwritten notes. Despite language barriers, practical cooperation emerged quickly. Locating supplies, organizing patient lists, and coordinating care for the wounded. Military command encouraged discipline toward medical personnel. American officers understood that humane treatment reinforced international law and supported post-war stability. Orders emphasized respect towards civilians and medical staff, even within enemy territory. Still, mistrust lingered. German nurses expected hostility. Some avoided eye contact. Others prepared mentally for interrogation or removal. Several accounts describe nurses hiding personal belongings or letters, fearing confiscation. Years of propaganda had conditioned them to expect harsh occupation policies. Instead, they encountered something unfamiliar: routine professionalism. American medics shared equipment when shortages became critical. Food rations were distributed to hospital staff alongside prisoners and civilians. Guards were posted not to intimidate, but to maintain order and prevent looting by displaced populations moving through war-torn regions. Gradually, tension eased into cautious coexistence. The hospital environment created a fragile neutrality where survival took priority over ideology. Wounded soldiers groaned in shared wards. Nurses moved between beds regardless of uniform color. American and German medical workers sometimes stood side by side over operating tables, illuminated by dim winter light. Outside, the war continued relentlessly. But inside these buildings, a quieter transformation was beginning, one built not on victory or defeat, but on shared exhaustion and the universal language of care. And as Christmas approached in that frozen winter of 1944, both sides prepared for a night none of them expected to remember for the rest of their lives. Inside wartime hospitals, identity blurred faster than on any battlefield. German nurses had been trained to serve the Reich, yet their daily reality revolved around human suffering rather than ideology. By late 1944, exhaustion overshadowed politics. Many had treated wounded teenagers sent directly from collapsing fronts. Others cared for civilians injured during bombings or refugees fleeing advancing armies. When American soldiers entered these hospitals, the nurses faced a profound psychological conflict. Only weeks earlier, propaganda had portrayed these men as ruthless enemies. Now those same soldiers carried stretchers, assisted surgeons, and quietly followed medical instructions. The nurse's role forced immediate adaptation. Professional ethics demanded neutrality. A wounded man was a patient first, nationality second. American medics noticed this quickly. Reports from U.S. Army Medical Corps personnel describe German nurses continuing their duties without hesitation, even when caring for Allied prisoners previously held by German forces. Shared work created unexpected empathy. Both sides recognized familiar signs: shaking hands from fatigue, ink-stained patient charts, uniforms stiff with dried antiseptic. War had shaped them differently, yet the hospital reduced everyone to caregivers and survivors. In this environment, hostility found little space to survive. Human need replaced ideology, and that shift prepared the emotional ground for what would follow. For American infantrymen, hospitals represented rare moments of stillness. Many soldiers arriving in Germany during winter 1944 had experienced months of relentless combat. The Hürtgen Forest and Ardennes campaigns exposed them to freezing conditions, artillery barrages, and close-quarter fighting. Entering a hospital felt almost unreal. Silence replacing gunfire, whispers replacing commands. They expected tension. Instead, they found order. German nurses moved calmly between beds. Patients lay wrapped in blankets. Candles sometimes replaced electric lighting due to damaged infrastructure. The atmosphere resembled civilian life more than war. This contrast affected soldiers deeply. Letters home from American troops occasionally mention encounters with enemy medical staff, described as tired like us, or just trying to help people live. Such observations did not erase wartime hatred, but they complicated it. The enemy no longer appeared abstract. He, or she, had a face, a voice, and shared exhaustion. As Christmas approached, homesickness intensified among American soldiers. Many were thousands of miles from family traditions. Snowfall and church bells in ruined towns reminded them of holidays spent far away from war. The hospital, unexpectedly, became the closest thing to a place of peace they had seen in months. Christmas held powerful meaning for both Americans and Germans. Despite political divisions, many traditions overlapped. Hymns, candlelight services, and religious observance remained deeply rooted in both cultures. German nurses grew up singing carols such as Stille Nacht, Silent Night, a song already famous worldwide. American soldiers recognized it too. Military chaplains often organized small Christmas gatherings wherever conditions allowed. These were rarely elaborate, sometimes only a prayer spoken quietly among exhausted troops. Yet even minimal observance offered emotional relief. In occupied hospitals, chaplains faced a unique question. Could Christmas be acknowledged among former enemies? Some officers hesitated, concerned about discipline or misunderstanding. Others believed shared religious tradition might ease tensions. What no one anticipated was how deeply familiar music could cross barriers language alone could not. Because within days, a simple decision to sing would transform the atmosphere of the hospital in a way no military order ever could. American command doctrine during the final phase of the European War emphasized control without unnecessary humiliation. By late 1944, Allied leadership understood that Germany's collapse was inevitable, but occupation policies would shape the peace that followed. Military commanders issued clear instructions regarding medical facilities. Hospitals were to remain protected spaces. Medical personnel were not to be treated as combatants unless resistance occurred. This policy aligned with Geneva Convention standards, but also reflected strategic thinking. Future stability required restraint. Officers recognized that interactions between soldiers and civilians would influence how Germans perceived occupation forces. Small gestures carried disproportionate weight. Respectful conduct inside hospitals signaled that victory did not require cruelty. Chaplains played an especially important role. They were tasked not only with supporting American troops, but also maintaining moral discipline. Many encouraged soldiers to remember shared religious traditions when encountering civilians, allowing a Christmas observance, even a modest one, fit within this broader philosophy. It demonstrated confidence rather than dominance. Leadership did not order compassion explicitly, yet it created conditions where humanity could emerge naturally. And when soldiers later gathered to sing, their actions reflected both personal impulse and institutional culture shaped by restraint. By December 1944, psychological fatigue affected nearly everyone inside wartime Europe. German nurses carried years of stress, air raids, shortages, and relentless casualty care. American soldiers carried combat trauma accumulated across France and Belgium. Both groups lived under constant emotional pressure. Music offered something rare: release without vulnerability. Psychologists studying wartime behavior later noted that singing allowed collective emotion to surface safely. Individuals could express grief, longing, or hope without speaking directly about fear or loss. Christmas hymns amplified this effect. Unlike patriotic songs tied to national identity, religious hymns belonged to shared spiritual tradition. They existed outside political ideology. When sung, they reminded participants of childhood memories, family gatherings, and life before war. For soldiers far from home, singing restored connection. For nurses surrounded by destruction, hearing familiar melodies reawakened memories, untouched by propaganda or military duty. The psychological barrier between enemy groups weakened not through discussion, but through shared emotional recognition. And once that barrier cracked, reactions became deeply personal. War depends on distance. Combat requires seeing the enemy as abstract, a uniform, a position, a threat. Moral clarity becomes easier when individuality disappears. Yet moments occasionally arise when that abstraction collapses. Hospitals created such moments. American soldiers saw women who had cared for wounded men, day after day. Not ideological opponents. German nurses saw young soldiers who resembled brothers or sons, rather than invaders. The planned Christmas hymn carried moral significance precisely because it was unnecessary. No regulation required it. No strategy demanded it. It was voluntary. When Americans chose to sing in German rather than English, they crossed a symbolic boundary. They acknowledged the humanity of those listening. They communicated respect in the listener's own language, an act that transformed the relationship occupier and occupied into something temporary. Historians later described similar wartime encounters as micro-reconciliations, small human exchanges that foreshadowed larger post-war healing. In that hospital, the war did not end officially. But for a brief moment, enemies recognized each other not as representatives of nations, but as people sharing the same fragile season of hope. And that recognition led directly to the story's emotional turning point. The night when music replaced silence. Snow fell in thin, uneven sheets across shattered rooftops and frozen courtyards. The front lines lay only miles away. But inside the captured town, the sounds of artillery had faded into distant echoes. A temporary stillness settled over the ruined streets, fragile, uncertain, almost unnatural after months of constant movement. Inside the hospital building, oil lamps burned low. Electricity worked only intermittently. Shadows stretched across tiled floors worn smooth by hurried footsteps and stretchers carried day and night. German nurses moved quietly between beds. They had continued working after American forces arrived weeks earlier. The wounded did not stop needing care simply because armies changed flags. Now they treated whoever arrived, German civilians, displaced refugees, and increasingly American soldiers injured in nearby fighting. Communication remained limited. Instructions passed through interpreters. Politeness replaced conversation. The emotional distance held. Outside, American soldiers finished evening duties. Many had expected to celebrate Christmas far from combat months earlier. Instead, they found themselves in unfamiliar towns, surrounded by enemy language and winter darkness. Packages from home arrived late or not at all. Letters were reread under dim light. Some soldiers gathered near the hospital courtyard, drawn by habit more than planning. A chaplain had suggested a brief Christmas observance, nothing formal, just a moment of reflection before returning to duty. They stood awkwardly at first, rifles leaned against a wall. Breath formed clouds in the cold air. Someone began humming quietly, almost absent-mindedly. The melody was familiar. Silent Night. At first it was only one voice. Then another joined. The hymn spread slowly among the group, hesitant but steady. Voices deepened, finding harmony despite fatigue and uneven pitch. The sound carried across the courtyard, rising gently into the winter air. Inside the hospital, movement stopped. One nurse paused beside a patient's bed, head turning toward the window. Another set down a metal tray, listening carefully as the melody filtered through cracked glass panes. They recognized it instantly. But something felt strange. The words were wrong. Not English. German. Stille Nacht. Heilige Nacht. The realization arrived gradually. American soldiers, occupying troops, were singing a German hymn in German. For a moment, no one moved. Nurses gathered near windows and doorways, uncertain whether to approach. Years of propaganda had taught them to expect mockery or dominance from victorious enemies. Yet the voices outside carried none of that. They sounded tired, earnest, almost reverent. The singing grew stronger. More soldiers joined, some struggling with pronunciation, but continuing anyway. The melody filled the courtyard, soft but unwavering. Inside, one nurse lowered herself into a chair, hands trembling slightly. Another covered her mouth as emotion rose unexpectedly. A third leaned against a wall, eyes closed. The war had taught them to suppress feeling. But the hymn belonged to childhood, to churches untouched by bombing, to families gathered around candlelight long before uniforms and ideology defined their lives. The language removed distance. It told them the soldiers outside understood what the song meant. When the final verse approached, the voices slowed naturally, almost reluctant to let the moment end. Snow continued falling, muffling every other sound. Then silence returned. No applause followed, no speeches. The soldiers simply stood quietly, heads lowered. Inside the hospital, tears appeared. Not dramatic, not loud, but unavoidable. For many nurses, it was the first time since the war began that emotion broke through discipline. Not because defeat had been confirmed, but because compassion had arrived where hostility was expected. And in that quiet courtyard, something irreversible had happened. The war still existed beyond the town's borders. But for a few minutes on Christmas Eve, enemies had shared the same song, and the meaning of victory and defeat began to change. The hymn ended without ceremony. American soldiers shifted their weight in the snow, unsure what to do next. Some cleared their throats. Others stared at the ground, embarrassed by their own emotion. The moment had not been planned, and now that it was over, ordinary military reality began creeping back in. Orders still existed. Patrols still waited. Yet none of the men moved immediately. A hospital door opened slowly behind them. The hinges creaked, a small sound, but loud in the winter stillness. Several soldiers turned instinctively, hands nearly reaching for rifles before recognition replaced reflex. A German nurse stepped outside. She wore a heavy coat over her uniform. Sleeves rolled slightly at the wrists from long hours of work. Snow touched her hair as she paused beneath the doorway light. For a second, uncertainty froze both sides in place. Occupation rules discouraged unnecessary interaction. Language barriers remained. And only weeks earlier, these same nations had fought each other with relentless violence. The nurse lowered her eyes briefly. Then she spoke, quietly, carefully. Danke. The word carried across the courtyard with surprising clarity. One of the American soldiers nodded awkwardly. Another removed his cap, unsure whether etiquette required formality or simplicity. No translator was present. None was needed. Behind her, more nurses appeared. They did not approach fully. They stood near the doorway, watching the soldiers with expressions difficult to define. Relief, disbelief, exhaustion. For years they had been told Americans were brutal enemies. Yet the men standing before them looked young, tired, and far from triumphant. One soldier attempted a response, in hesitant German, learned from a phrase booklet. Frohe Weihnachten. The pronunciation was imperfect, but the intention unmistakable. A faint smile crossed one nurse's face before quickly fading, as if smiling at an enemy still felt forbidden. Another wiped her eyes discreetly, turning away so patients inside would not see. In that exchange, hierarchy dissolved. There were no victors or defeated, only people far from home on a winter night. The chaplain stepped forward slightly, offering a small nod of respect rather than authority. He did not preach. He did not explain. The moment required no interpretation. Instead, one of the soldiers began humming again. Softer this time, not a performance, just memory. Unexpectedly, a German voice joined from the doorway, then another. Soon, Americans and Germans sang together. Not loudly, not confidently, but carefully, as if testing whether such a thing was allowed. For decades, historians would compare this moment to earlier wartime Christmas truces. Yet the difference here was profound. This was not soldiers refusing to fight temporarily. The fighting had already ended for this town. This was reconciliation, beginning before anyone had planned it. The nurse's tears came not from sentimentality, but from psychological release. Months of fear. Fear of invasion, fear of revenge, fear of survival under enemy control, dissolved in the realization that the occupying soldiers recognized their culture, their faith, their humanity. American troops felt a shift as well. Combat had taught them to see uniforms first. Now they saw caregivers who had spent years treating wounded under bombing raids, who were as exhausted by war as anyone wearing Allied insignia. When the final notes faded again, no one applauded. Instead, a soldier reached into his coat pocket and removed a small chocolate bar from a ration pack. He hesitated, then extended it toward the nearest nurse. She accepted carefully, bowing slightly, a gesture of gratitude rather than submission. Others exchanged small nods. Nothing more. Orders eventually called the soldiers back to barracks. Boots crunched through snow as they dispersed quietly, leaving the courtyard empty once again. The nurses returned inside. But something had changed permanently. Patients later noticed the difference. Voices among the staff sounded lighter, movements less mechanical. One nurse reportedly hummed the hymn again while preparing bandages, the melody lingering like warmth in cold air. The war had not ended everywhere. Yet in that hospital courtyard, the psychological boundary between enemy and human being had been crossed. And once crossed, it could never fully be rebuilt. The consequences of that night would follow both sides long after the snow melted, shaping memory, occupation, and the fragile peace that followed. In the days following Christmas 1945, life inside the occupied German town resumed its disciplined rhythm. American patrols continued their routes. Curfews remained in place. Military vehicles moved through narrow streets, still lined with shattered windows and collapsed roofs. Officially, Nothing had changed, yet those who lived and worked near the hospital sensed a subtle shift. The atmosphere softened. American soldiers who had once approached medical facilities with cautious distance now greeted staff with brief nods. Some attempted simple German phrases learned from translators or phrase books issued by occupation authorities. The exchanges were small, practical words about supplies or schedules, but they carried an unfamiliar tone. Mutual recognition. For the German nurses, the transformation was equally quiet. Before Christmas, many had expected occupation to bring humiliation or punishment. Nazi propaganda had warned relentlessly that Allied troops would seek revenge. Even after surrender, fear lingered, fear of arrest, displacement, or public disgrace. The hymn disrupted those expectations. Military psychologists later described such moments as contact shocks, instances when lived experience contradicted years of ideological conditioning. The nurses had witnessed American soldiers voluntarily entering their cultural world, not as conquerors, but as participants in shared tradition. This realization altered behavior inside the hospital. Observers recorded increased cooperation between medical staff and occupation personnel. Requests for supplies became easier to negotiate. Communication barriers gradually lowered as trust replaced suspicion. American medics occasionally consulted German nurses about local treatment practices, recognizing their experience gained under wartime shortages. Practical necessity accelerated human connection. The hospital itself remained overwhelmed. Malnutrition cases increased during the harsh winter of 1945 to 46. Refugees arrived from eastern territories lost during the war. Tuberculosis and respiratory illness spread among displaced civilians living in damaged housing. Under these pressures, collaboration became unavoidable. American authorities, guided by occupation policy emphasizing stabilization rather than punishment, increasingly relied on German civilian professionals, especially nurses, to maintain public health systems. Their skills were indispensable. The Christmas encounter helped make this cooperation possible. Nurses who had previously avoided prolonged interaction with soldiers now engaged professionally without visible fear. Likewise, American troops began to view German medical personnel not as remnants of an enemy system, but as partners in rebuilding order. Letters written by American soldiers during early 1946 occasionally referenced the event indirectly. One infantryman wrote home describing how the Germans cried when we sang their church song, noting that it made him realize the war had been fought between governments, not ordinary people. Such reflections were common among occupation troops encountering civilians for the first time outside combat conditions. For the nurses, however, the emotional impact ran deeper. The hymn provided psychological permission to grieve openly. During wartime, emotional restraint had been necessary for survival amid constant casualties. After surrender, grief remained suspended, overshadowed by uncertainty and fear of the future. That Christmas night allowed release. In oral histories recorded decades later, several German medical workers described it as the moment they understood the war was truly finished. Not because of official announcements, but because former enemies demonstrated compassion without obligation. The occupation continued, strict and structured. Germany remained divided and devastated, but inside one hospital courtyard, reconciliation had begun before diplomacy could formalize it. A human process unfolding quietly alongside political reconstruction. And as winter turned towards spring, the longer consequences of that moment would begin shaping how both nations remembered not only the end of war, but the beginning of peace itself. As 1946 progressed, the Allied occupation of Germany entered a new phase, one defined less by military victory and more by reconstruction. Across the American occupation zone, hospitals became critical centers of stabilization. Disease prevention, civilian treatment, and refugee care were now strategic priorities. War had destroyed not only infrastructure, but trust, and restoring basic medical services became essential to preventing social collapse. German nurses stood at the center of this effort. Many had worked through years of bombing, shortages, and overwhelming casualty numbers. Despite ideological pressures during the Nazi era, their professional training remained rooted in practical care. American occupation authorities quickly recognized that rebuilding healthcare without German participation was impossible. Cooperation deepened. Joint medical teams formed in several regions. American Army Medical Corps supplied antibiotics, surgical equipment, and food supplements previously unavailable under wartime blockade. German nurses provided local knowledge, language, patient histories, and familiarity with civilian needs. The relationship was cautious at first, but shared labor dissolved distance faster than policy ever could. Former enemies worked side by side, treating malnourished children, elderly civilians, and displaced families arriving daily from ruined cities. The work left little space for ideology. Survival required collaboration. In reports from U.S. military government offices, administrators noted improved morale among both occupation troops and civilian staff where cooperative medical programs operated. Incidents of hostility declined. Communication increased. Mutual reliance replaced suspicion. Historians later argued that such everyday interactions formed the emotional foundation of post-war reconciliation long before political alliances emerged. The Christmas hymn lingered in memory as a symbolic beginning. Though rarely mentioned in official documents, personal accounts from both Americans and Germans referenced moments when cultural gestures softened occupation tensions. Music, shared meals, and religious traditions became informal bridges between societies that had recently fought one of history's most destructive wars. For many German nurses, the experience reshaped their perception of the victors. Instead of the brutal enemy described by propaganda, they encountered individuals capable of empathy and restraint. This did not erase suffering or responsibility for the war's devastation, but it complicated simplistic narratives of hatred. Likewise, American soldiers returned home with altered perspectives. Letters and memoirs written years later frequently described encounters with civilians that challenged wartime stereotypes. Seeing German medical workers caring for wounded children or elderly patients humanized a population previously defined only as adversaries. These psychological shifts carried lasting consequences. As the Cold War emerged and West Germany gradually integrated into Western political and economic systems, public attitudes toward cooperation with former enemies proved more adaptable than many policymakers expected. Cultural familiarity, built through thousands of small interactions like those in hospitals, eased the transition. The nurses themselves rarely spoke publicly about the Christmas night. Post-war Germany emphasized rebuilding and forward movement rather than revisiting emotional memories of defeat. Many resumed ordinary lives, raising families, or continuing medical careers in newly reorganized healthcare systems. Yet in private recollections recorded decades later, the memory remained vivid, not as a dramatic turning point, but as proof that humanity could survive even the deepest divisions of war. The soldiers eventually rotated home. Occupation policies evolved. Germany rebuilt. But the echo of a hymn sung in a damaged courtyard endured, a reminder that reconciliation often begins quietly, carried not by governments, but by ordinary people willing to recognize one another beyond uniforms. And from that quiet aftermath emerges the final meaning of the story, one that reaches beyond a single night toward the larger question of how enemies become neighbors again. Wars are remembered through offensives, treaties, and the rise and fall of nations. Maps change, armies advance, leaders sign documents that declare victory or defeat. Yet history often turns on moments too small to record officially. Inside a damaged German hospital on Christmas Eve 1944, no strategy shifted and no territory changed hands. The war continued outside, artillery still echoing across winter fields. But within that ward, something quieter occurred, a brief suspension of fear. The American soldiers who sang did not end the war. The German nurses who listened did not forget loss or responsibility. Nothing about the conflict itself was undone. What changed was perception. For years, propaganda on both sides had reduced the enemy to an abstraction, cruel, faceless, irredeemable. War depends on such distance. It allows violence to feel necessary. But the sound of a familiar hymn, sung in a shared language, disrupted that distance for a few fragile minutes. It reminded both sides of something older than ideology, common culture, shared faith traditions, and the universal experience of longing for home during war. Historians often describe reconciliation as a political process shaped by diplomacy and economics. Yet long before alliances form, reconciliation begins emotionally, when individuals recognize humanity where they expected hatred. The nurses did not weep because the war ended that night. They wept because, for the first time since destruction reached their homeland, they saw compassion from those they had been taught to fear. And the soldiers sang not as conquerors, but as young men far from home, seeking familiarity in a foreign winter. After the war, Germany rebuilt. Former enemies became partners. Institutions changed, borders stabilized, and new generations grew up without memory of total conflict. But beneath those transformations lay countless small encounters, gestures never planned, never ordered. Moments like a hymn sung softly in a ruined hospital. Because sometimes the true end of war is not marked by surrender. It begins when one side hears the other sing and realizes the voice sounds human.